Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 733 for the 11th of Kislev in a regular year. There is a story told most famously by the late author David Foster Wallace in his commencement speech about two younger fish swimming in the water, and they pass by an older fish who says to them, "How's the water today?" And they look a little baffled and they keep swimming, and one of the younger fish turns to the other and says, "What's water?" So it's a really short story, and the basic point of this story, there's been a lot of lessons that can be taken from the story, but the basic idea is that sometimes we are so acclimated to the atmosphere around us that we become oblivious to it, whether we're talking about the actual physical air around us, whether we're talking about the social climate or things like that. So we can understand this in a spiritual sense as well, that here we are living in this physical reality, and we take so many things for granted. We take our lives for granted. We take the sun rising and setting in the morning for granted. We take the air we breathe, the water we drink for granted. And the fact that there's a godliness that pervades all of it is something that we may not even recognize because it's just here, because we're immersed in it so much. It's easy for us to forget our origins. It's easy for us to sometimes forget the fact that we actually have a source, that there is a creator to the world. So this, in a sense, we can understand as kind of like the point of Chassidus, to remind us of our origins, to remind us of our source. One way to kind of think about this is in terms of the birth of a child. So we all know, right, as adults, that a newborn baby, has a mother, and that it came from its mother's womb, that it was once part of its mother's womb, and now it emerged, and now it's something of its own, that it's something apart from its mother. But the baby, for the first little while, until it really gains full cognition, it might not be aware of this. It might feel an affinity towards mother. It might kind of on a subconscious level realize that there's something about the mother that it's attached to, but it's not consciously aware of the fact that it is part of the mother. And in fact, when this same child was a fetus inside of the mother's womb, even then, while perhaps you could say that the child was in fact more attached to the mother, in a way, it actually is less aware of the mother because it's really more fully immersed in the mother. Like a child that's born, now it can look up and it can see the mother. The mother is something apart from the child versus the child in the mother's womb, the fetus in the womb, the mother and the child are one and the same. So the mother, the fetus feels the nourishment that it's receiving and this like sac that it's clothed within, and it feels this support and this comfort, but at the same time, it's not quite aware of the source of where this nourishment is coming from. So we can think of these as kind of two states of being. There's the prenatal state before the child is born, and then there's the postnatal state, the birth of the child. And this is going to be the focus of what we're going to be discussing today in today's Tanya, in terms of how godliness is manifest in both a prenatal state and a postnatal state, and how the laws of the Torah, the halachas of the Torah, can be thought of as godliness as manifest in a prenatal state, which really miraculously we get a glimpse of here in this world, and we can attach to in our world by performing the commandments of the Torah, even though really ultimately they are sourced in this prenatal state, and we're tapping into this prenatal state, versus by contrast, our bodies and even our souls and the souls of the angels even, can be thought of more as a postnatal state. This is they come about through birth. So these are two different states of being, and both have advantages and disadvantages, obviously. Just like if you think about in terms of a child, that on the one hand, you can say that there's something really miraculous and magnificent about the fact that there is now this child in a postnatal state, this child that's born that is apart from its mother, that has a living, breathing life of its own. Nevertheless, on the other hand, there is a detachment that happens in that birth process, that the child is now detached from its mother in a manifest way, the way that it was not when it was in its prenatal form as a fetus within the mother's womb. So the context of this discussion and why we're talking about these things is, just to put it into context, we've been studying this very esoteric section of the Tanya. It's essay 4 of Kuntres Acharon, which is known for being a very, very esoteric, very abstract section of the Tanya. It's the very end of the Tanya. And we've been talking about the mitzvos, the Torah, service, our prayer, love and fear of God, the interplay of all of these things. What's higher, what's lower, what attaches us to God in a more essential way and a less essential way. And the focus of what we've been talking about in the past few days is mitzvahs, and how it is that mitzvahs attach us to God in a more essential way than even our internally and intellectually generated love and fear of God, and even the intellectually generated love and fear of God of the angels. So today's section addresses this point, and it talks about the fact of how even the highest level within our world, within our created world, is actually considered to be lower to a certain extent than the mitzvahs themselves, which, even though on the map it appears like the mitzvahs are being transmitted from a lower place. And so it does get kind of technical, this Tanya, and so I'll try to get through it as articulately as possible. But again, this is very dense, this section, and kind of the key takeaway in trying to understand all of this is that a lot of these terms in Chassidus, as I've mentioned several times, are very relativistic kind of terms. And that's what makes it tricky, and that's where it's like sort of hard to like draw a map of what's going on in the spiritual sense of the spheros and the the souls and all that stuff, because things are kind of constantly in motion, and it depends on what aspect of what thing we're looking at. So some introductory kind of like review terms to be familiar with in going through this are a few things. So first of all, we know that there are 4 general worlds, right? There are 4 general spiritual worlds. There's the worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. And Atzilus is kind of set apart from the other worlds because Atzilus is the world of emanation, and the worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya are the worlds of creation. They're created worlds, so they're more separate from God. For the sake of our discussion today, and again, only for the sake of our discussion today, because in another context, the following analogy would not necessarily apply, but for the sake of our discussion today, Atzilus can be thought of as the prenatal state. Atzilus can be thought of as like the pre-birth state, when the worlds, the beings within the world of Atzilus are still one and unified with their source, meaning God in this sense. Versus when we talk about the lower worlds, the worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, these are the postnatal state. This is where there's an actual creation. There's something separate, so to speak, from God. Even though, of course, we know nothing is really separate from God, but it's they recognize themselves as being separate from God. There's an observed separate reality from God. Okay, now within each one of these worlds, there are different levels. Another way to think about this is that the vitality of these worlds, we can call the vitality of these worlds like the souls of these worlds. Now, the soul of each world can be divided up into different levels. So in a general sense, we can say that the soul of each world can be divided up into 3 different levels. There's the level of the neshama of each world, there's the level of the ruach of each world, and then there's the level of the nefesh of each world. Now, the level of neshama of each world is the highest, and then the ruach and the nefesh are the 2 lower ones. And for the sake of our discussion today, we're going to lump those two levels together, the nefesh and the ruach. So the neshama level of each world, that's thought of as to be as sort of like the mind of each world. And it's really it never really takes on a full life of its own. It's sort of like the vitality of the world without actually being the world itself, if that makes sense. And then the ruach and the nefesh, on the other hand, are the more like nitty gritty. Like this is the makeup of the actual world. Now, within each one of these levels, the nefesh, the neshama, the ruach, and the nefesh, we have the 10 spheros, which the 10 spheros that we've spoken about are like the 10 energies that pervade and sort of like, they're like the mechanisms through which everything comes about. So it's like categories within subcategories within subcategories. So again, it's like we can kind of like point to like the malchus level of the nefesh of the world of Yetzirah. Let's say it would be like a little point on the map that we're describing, right? And then to get even further into this, if we examine the spheros, as we've discussed in the past, the spheros themselves can be divided up into kind of lumps, where it's like we have the first 3 spheros, which are Chochmah Bina Das, that's the intellectual spheros. Then we have the emotive spheros, which are Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, which can be thought of as the Zer Anpin, the small face, it's known as. And then we have Malchus, which is the Nukva, the feminine aspect at the bottom of the spheros. So I know this is like super technical, but hopefully at this point anyways, some of these terms are a little bit more familiar to you. And again, we'll try to get through this together. So now for today's podcast episode, the star of the show, so to speak, like what we're really going to be focusing on in terms of this whole map is one specific term. What is that specific term? That's the term, the neshama. The neshama is an interesting thing because the neshama, if you recall, each world has 3 soul levels, neshama, ruach, and nefesh. So the neshama of each world serves this really interesting purpose. As we mentioned, the neshama of each world is the highest part of each world, and it can be thought of as sort of like the vitality, the spiritual energy of each world, like sort of like that, the vitality that gives life to everything else that's going on within that world. And now the way that the neshama does this is it kind of serves as an intermediary between that which is above it to that which is below it. So on the one hand, the neshama of each world is receiving from the world above it. And on the other hand, that same neshama is giving to the levels of nefesh and of ruach and nefesh in that world. So where this can get confusing, and this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to clarify today, is that when we're talking about the spheros, or really any of these things, but for today we're going to be talking about the spheros. So when we're talking about the spheros, the highest of all the spheros is Chochmah, as we mentioned, and the lowest of all the spheros is Malchus. And so when we're talking about Chochmah versus Malchus, if we had like a pop quiz and we were to say what's higher, Chochmah or Malchus, you most likely would say Chochmah, because if you've been learning the podcast so far. But on the other hand, if you zoom out a little bit, and then you say, well, wait a second, which Chochmah are we talking about? Which world are we talking about? Which level of soul within that world are we talking about? And which level of, which Malchus are we talking about? Which world are we talking about? Which level of the soul are we talking about? And then you see how these terms can be very relative. And then you see how actually the Malchus of Bria, for example, is actually much higher than the Chochmah of Asiyah. To translate this into kind of like normal human speak in English language is that this clarifies something, a thought, which the Alter Rebbe had concluded yesterday's podcast on, about how it is that even that the halachos, that the laws of the Torah, as they descend and they go through like many, many, many levels of descent, and they come to the lowest level of descent, and then they come into our world, even as they come into this lowest level of descent for them in our world, it's still, that lowest level of descent is still higher than the highest level of our world, which is the level of the neshama of our world. And how this all works, the technicalities of how this works. So again, today's episode is very technical, and so just, stick with it and get whatever you can out of it. But that's kind of the main takeaway. The main takeaway is this idea of how it is that the halachos in the world, that the halachos of the Torah, the laws of the Torah are higher than anything else that is found in our world. That we can think of the halachos of the Torah as being the prenatal vitality versus we're living in this postnatal vitality, and the halachas are a way for us to attach to our prenatal source, basically, is the way that I'm visualizing all of this. So the Alter Rebbe begins today, and he says that the reason for this is because the Chochmah Bina Das of Asiyah, of the aspect of the Neshama, is the source of the Chochmah Bina Das of the Nefesh and Ruach and all of their offshoots. up until the very end of everything, this entire earth and all of its hosts. So the basic idea with the Alter was starting off with us here. He's telling us how our world comes into being on a technical spiritual level. And he says that the way that our world and everything within our world comes into being is through the neshama of our world. So again, every world has a neshama, nefesh, and ruach of it. So it comes via the chabad within the neshama of our world. And that chabad of the neshama of our world gets transmitted through the nefesh and ruach of our world and the offshoots of all of that. And that creates everything in our world. Okay, so now, by contrast, when we look at the halachos, they have a very different channel through which they come through and manifest in our world. Their channel is they come from the Chochmah Bina Das of Malchus of Bria and Yetzira. So the Chochmah Bina Das of the Neshama of Asiya, the world of Asiya, brings about creation in our world, versus the Chochmah Bina Das of the Malchus of Bria and Yetzira is the source for the halachos. Okay, so now what's the difference? So the Chochmah within the levels of Malchus of Bria and Yetzira, the idea of the Chochmah is that the function of the Chochmah there is to be metaken, to rectify the partsufim of Atzilus. So partsufim is a whole topic in its own right. That could be a whole podcast episode on its own, but the partsufim of Atzilus, loosely translated as like visages of Atzilus, like the faces within Atzilus, they could be thought of as sort of like the expanded manifestation of the spheros within Atzilus. So we know that the spheros have all, like, again, there's like an interplay of all of them, and they're interwoven one within the next, so that you have like the 10 spheros, and then within each one of the 10 spheros are all of the 10 spheros. But like in a more concentrated fashion, we focus specifically on the mitzvos, the emotive character traits, and the main emotive character traits are the first 5, because the lower 2 of Yesod and Malchus are more in terms of how these emotive attributes manifest themselves. But the 5 emotive attributes, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, and Hod, are like the main body of the emotive attributes. And so within those 5 attributes, each one of those contain 5 within them. So and so it's like there's like chesed of chesed, chesed of gvura, chesed of tiferet, chesed of netzach, and chesed of yesod, right? And of the emotive attributes, the 2 main emotive attributes are chesed and gvura. So this is what we reference when we say the hey chasadim and the hey gvuros, the 5 chasadim and the 5 gvuros, which comes up a lot in Chassidus. This is what we mean. We mean that we're talking about that with the 5 chasadim are chesed of chesed, gvura of chesed, tiferet of chesed, netzach of chesed, and hod of chesed. The hey gvuros, the 5 gvuros, are chesed of gvura, gvura of gvura, tiferet of gvura, netzach of gvura, and hod of gvura. So that's sort of like the expanded manifestation of chesed and the expanded manifestation of gvura. And that we can call the faces within Atzilus, right? And so getting back to the text, so the Alter Rebbe explains to us today that these partsufim, what are these partsufim within Atzilus? These partsufim are the reasons behind the mitzvahs. These are the reasoning behind the mitzvahs. And so now going back to the map of where the halachas are found on the map. So we said that the halachas are found on the map within the chabad of the Malchus of Bria and Yetzira. So the chabad, the chochmah of the Malchus of Bria and Yetzira, what is that? What does that chochmah do? That chochmah rectifies the reasoning of the mitzvahs, that rectifies these partsufim within Atzilus. So how does it do this, to be specific? So the positive commandments are related to the hey chasadim, which is like the right side of the face. We can think of it as the right side of that face. And the negative commandments, the prohibitions, have to do with the hey gvuros, with the left side of the face, with the 5 gvuros. And so thus, since like they're really sourced, like the halachas basically are like they're their origin is in this going upwards to be mataken, to rectify these visages within the world of Atzilus. Thus, when they come down and they become manifest here within the created world, even within the level of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, which is like the lowest level of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, they become manifest specifically because they're coming, like the way that this happens is through the kelim, through the vessels of Atzilus. And so thus the way that they manifest is through the level of neshama. And not on the level of nefesh and ruach, because nefesh and ruach is more related to created beings versus anything having to do with Atzilus is more emanation. So when we're talking about this level of the vessels of Atzilus, then we know that has to do more with the neshama level. So to summarize that once again, so basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that the source of the mitzvahs, like when we learn mitzvah, when we learn halacha, these are coming from the level of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah. And this level of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, where within Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah is it found? It's from the Chabad of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, which the Chabad of Malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, the function of this Chabad, or the function of the Chochmah, to be more specific, is to rectify the partsufim within the level of Atzilus, which means that there's a connection there's like a core connection between the halachos and the world of Atzilus. And so thus when the halachos get translated down into here, they come through the kelim of Atzilus, through the vessels of Atzilus, but there's still this like very core attachment to the world of Atzilus when they come down here into this world. And so since there's this very core attachment to the world of Atzilus that they never really separate from the world of Atzilus from which they come, is the basic idea. Thus, the way they manifest within these worlds of Bria and Yetzirah is on the neshama level, because the neshama level is more kind of like abstract. It's not a creation the way that level of ruach and nefesh are, right? Okay, so now the Alter Rebbe asks a question on all this. So it seems like what seems to be implied from this discussion, if you've been sort of following it along, is that the halachos, due to their lofty origin within the world of Atzilus, cannot fully come down and create anything because they're too lofty. The whole idea of Atzilus is the antithesis of creation. Atzilus is like its emanation. It's totally godly. It's prenatal. It's connected to its source. All of that kind of stuff. But yet the halachas, the way that they get drawn down and translated into us is through the level of malchus, which within the worlds of Bria and Yetzirah, specifically within the level of malchus of Bria and Yetzirah, and then it manifests as the neshama within each one of those worlds. So now the question is that if you have been following along yesterday's episode, we spoke about the created beings, the angels within the worlds of Bria and Yetzirah, and we said what's the origin of the angels within the worlds of Bria and Yetzirah? The origin of the angels within those worlds is from Chochmah Bina Das of these worlds. So this seems to be a big question because what's higher, Chochmah Bina Das or Malchus? If you've been learning the podcast for a while, you know Chochmah Bina Das is higher than Malchus, right? So if the source of the angels within these worlds of Bria and Yetzirah is Chochmah Bina Das, Chabad, how could it be, like that's a very high source, but yet we're saying that the source of the halachos is only malchus of each one of these worlds? So how could it be that we're saying that the halachos are so lofty and so great that they can't actually become anything? They're not actually creations. They're just like more like these like emanations. They're connected to Atzilus, where their source is actually lower, seemingly, in these worlds than the source of created beings, which comes from Chabad. So the Alter Rebbe continues and he says this actually isn't a question. It's not a challenge. And he explains why. He says because it's true that the malachim, the angels and the souls, they are created beings within these worlds, but they're coming. Yes, they come from Chochmah Bina Das, which is a very high level of the neshama. But they're coming from a very small droplet, a tipa, like it's likened to semen, really. It's a very small droplet that comes from, yes, this higher level of Chabad, of Chochmah Bina Das, of the neshama of that world, into the Zer Anpin of that world, the Yesod of the Zer Anpin, which is that the sixth attribute of their Zer Anpin, and given to the Nukva, to the Malchus, which is the lowest of the world. And from there, they emerged by way of birth, of Leda, right? So Basically, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that when we say that these souls and these angels are coming from this place of Chabad, of the worlds of Bria and Yetzirah, that's true, but they're getting like a very little, very diluted droplet. They're not getting the actual Chachma Bina Das of it. And even if we say, says the Alter Rebbe, that they came about, that their creation came from the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus, of Nukva of Atzilus, nevertheless, these kelim, these vessels, then descended and became the neshama for the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. But the essence of the Chachma Bina Das, not just like a little droplet, but the actual essence of the Chachma Bina Das does not descend in the way that this droplet does to create these droplets to create the angels and the souls, but it actually expands into the in six directions of Zer Anpin and Nukva. So it's the six attributes, the six emotive attributes, and the seventh, the Malchus. And this is what we can understand to be. This is the source and the origin of the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the six orders of the Mishnah, and the Gemara. So that is a lot. That was a mouthful today. I think this is maybe the most intricate and complex section of the Tanya. So if you had difficulty following it today, I really apologize. I tried my best to explain this in a very articulate way, but again, it's very dense stuff, I know. And again, the main takeaway that you want to get from this, and the Alter Rebbe is going to continue and expound on this even more tomorrow when we conclude this essay, is that the origin of the mitzvahs comes from a very lofty place that is that gets translated to us in an undiluted form that is very unique, because everything else that we experience, even our love and fear of God, even the angels, even our souls, are all coming from, yes, they might be coming from like a higher place, quote unquote, technically speaking, but it's in a more diluted format, and it's more, there was more of a break. We can think of it more as like a creation, as a birth. There's a birth. So it's sort of like once you have a birth of a child, even if this child is perfect and was just born just right now, there's a separation between the child and the mother in a way that doesn't exist when we talk about the fetus as it exists within the mother, even if that fetus is not fully formed yet. And if we could somehow tap into our prenatal state, there's something very unique and special about that. It's like we're sort of tapping into our origin. So, and that's sort of the idea, is that when we learn halachos, when we engage in halachos in Jewish law, we're tapping into something that is higher than anything else that we can experience in our postnatal state down here. So that's it for today. And once again, I hope I did a good job in explaining this stuff to you guys, because, and I know there's a lot more there. There's probably a lot more that I could have explained, and layers upon layers of this kind of stuff, but hopefully this was sufficient for today, and we will continue tomorrow when we conclude this essay, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.